el doctor Andrew Stirling, que es un experto en temas muy interesantes. Él actualmente es profesor de Ciencia y Tecnología en la Unidad de Investigación en Política Científica de la Universidad de Sussex, en el Reino Unido. Y él tiene una carrera académica muy extensa y ha sido más o menos en esta universidad pues, en varias funciones desde hace más de 30 años. Actualmente, además de su profesorado, es miembro de la Academia de Ciencias Sociales del Reino Unido. Tiene numerosas actividades de consultoría, tanto para la sociedad como para los gobiernos o para la industria. Y básicamente lo que él estudia son las interacciones entre ciencia, sociedad, tecnología y medio ambiente. Y se concentra en los aspectos que tienen que ver con el poder, con la incertidumbre y con la diversidad en ciencia y tecnología. Y hoy nos va a hablar de uno de los temas controversiales, que es el de los organismos genéticamente modificados. So, Andy, I thank you very much for your kind disposition to illustrate us, and hopefully we'll have many questions later on.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, and thank you, Julio, for your introduction, and thank you everybody involved in inviting me to this discussion with such a distinguished group of researchers in this crucial area of science. I realize that you guys are at the front end of these issues that I'm going to speak about in many ways. So I really look forward to the discussion that we have at the end of my talk. And I thank you especially for your patience in allowing me to give this talk in English, which is an enormous and unjustified privilege on my part. I will try to make sure that I am as clear as possible in my delivery. But if there are any difficulties, technical or otherwise, please do interrupt me if it is not clear, if something is going awry and not making sense. I will find my slides. Here we are. So you see, I hope, my topic are GM controversies about anti-science or innovation democracy. And I have framed it in terms of GM controversies about the use of genetic modification, genetic manipulation, gene editing technologies, because that is an area that I have worked in quite closely, serving on advisory committees in a European setting. But I'm aware that the issues that I will discuss in this talk, in principle, relate to all technological controversies. At the moment, of course, around the world, we're seeing uncertainties playing out around the COVID-19 pandemic and also the vaccination responses. And I understand that your institute is doing cutting-edge work in many aspects of that. So I realize that you will be very familiar for that reason also. I am being deliberately provocative in the way that I present this. I think I was invited because I gave another talk at the sister institute at UNAM at LANCIS, the Ecological Institute. And I think that was somehow connected to this invitation, which I'm very grateful for. So I'm aware that the way I'm framing these issues could be controversial. So I say at the beginning, before I start, that my own commitment in this work is one of absolute admiration for science. I think science is one of the most precious, if not the most precious part of our civilization. And my purpose, and you may not agree with me in this, and we can have, I hope, a good discussion about that, but my purpose is to help protect science from some political pressures that I think are very dangerous at the moment. So that's my starting point. I figured I should explain. So are GM controversies then about a problem of the general public and particular interest groups in society being anti-science, anti-technology in their general positions? Or is it about science itself being allowed or being forced to erode democracy and therefore getting a lot of pressure back? That's my question at the beginning. And when I address this, I'm going to take a step back at some of the deep political issues around science and technology, some of the serious problems in the current world in the way we speak about science and technology. Because that is quite critical, I feel a responsibility to also be positive and say concrete things about methods. I will say some things in the last part of my talk about ways to address the problems that I raise, practical methods, practical values and principles, so that I am not just criticizing, but also trying to be positive. And then I will put it at the end in a context of trying to answer this question that we begin with. And I look forward very much to the discussion at the end. So my starting point is this. I think it is a rule of thumb among social anthropologists that if you want to get a good idea very quickly about some of the deepest tensions in a society, ask about the creation myth. Because it is in stories about the origins of society that narratives play out around what the biggest tensions are in the world as it is at the moment. So let us ask then about this civilization of globalizing modernity around the world with different forms in different places, but increasingly homogenized. What is the origin myth of modernity? I would say a pretty good candidate for that is the story of progress. The story that science gives us technology, and it is technology that principally drives progress. And we see this across different sectors, the same kind of story playing out in transport, in materials, in IT and computing, in the military, in all kinds of other areas of biotechnology, that somehow what comes out of the research and innovation system is progress. And we can't really imagine that there is anything that could alternatively have happened. This idea of there being no alternative, because when political power is challenged, there is no more potent argument than that there is no alternative. If you don't like it, you must accept it because there is no alternative. I put the Economist front cover from a few years ago up there because that issue discussed new financial technologies coming in that the Economist was worried were implicated in the 2008 financial crash. But the Economist story linked this to human evolution, saying technology is like evolution, it has to improve, we can't do anything about it, whatever comes along, there is no alternative. And the Economist said, we may have a risk from these technologies, but there is no alternative. And we find this language around the world across remarkably different settings, different political contexts, which actually in other ways are in quite a lot of tension with one another, that science is something that we need to restore to its rightful dominant place in driving events, that our hopes as societies rely on scientific progress, and crucially, that one cannot stop scientific progress. And in other settings, like for instance in Europe at the moment, we see this idea, central organizing idea for Europe of the pro-innovation union, that the European institutions regard themselves as being pro-innovation. And when criticism comes of the aerospace policy, the security policy, IT policy, biotech policy, that is called anti-innovation in this setting. This is a statement by a former British Prime Minister, but I think maybe this is quite common around the world. It may be the kind of language that people in this group are also quite familiar with. This is the British Royal Academy of Engineering, who quite nicely, just a few years ago in a program for the British World Service radio station, called history a race to advanced technology. A race. A race is something that one runs in a single track. The question is simply who is winning the race. The job of government is to strive to stay in the race. It's quite an interesting reflection of a British attitude. We just want to stay in the race. We don't want to win it. We just want to stay in. Other countries are trying to win the race. And the role of the public in this vision, according to the British Royal Academy of Engineering, is to give technology the status it deserves, to stand back, to admire, to afford status, and not interfere. And if you think I'm being a little bit harsh by drawing on political statements like this, here are some key terms used. My institute, the Science Policy Research Unit, works on the policy making, advises many governments around the world in making of innovation policy. And in this list here are some of the crucial analytical concepts used when advising the World Bank, the United Nations Development Programme, the OECD, notions of advance, of early moving, first moving, catching up, latecomers, forging ahead, leapfrogging, falling behind. These are sometimes Nobel Prize winning concepts in the economics of innovation. And one doesn't need to look very hard to see that the general notion of many of these concepts only makes sense in the context of a race. So although economists and academics working on science and technology and innovation will always say, no, it's not as simple as this, we're much more nuanced and complex than this linear model that I show here, and of course the language can be, underlying that is this idea of a one-track race. In any given sector, what comes out of the system is determined by the nature of the science. So what this means then around the world, when we discuss science and technology as societies, despite our differences, the questions that tend to get asked are, how much of this technology should we have? How fast should we go with it? What are the risks that we should accept? Who is ahead and who is behind? These are questions that are allowed, that are permissible from this language around the world. And what gets missed out, both in the political debates and in the more analytical discussions, are questions like, which way should we go in food production, in transport, in energy? What are the alternatives to the most loudly proposed technologies? Says who and why? This kind of language is airbrushing that kind of question out. And this is strange, because although philosophers and historians and social scientists and economists of many kinds will disagree about many details about the process of moving from science through research to innovation, technology, they agree on one thing. It is not like that. That is not how innovation works. Innovation in any given sector, and no one I think knows this better than a research institute, is looking forward, displays a diverse array of alternative possible pathways, radically different pathways. So for instance, in thinking about what kinds of innovations might help society produce more effective, more productive seeds for agriculture and feeding the world, then we face a vast array of different kinds of possible innovation pathways. Of course, gene editing, synthetic biology techniques. There are big differences, as I'm sure colleagues here know better than me, between transgenics and cisgenics, big differences of environmental implications, of political economy. Apomixis, are we choosing seeds that allow farmers to propagate plants themselves? And then moving out of these advanced biotech solutions, we have other pathways, industrial hybrids of a conventional kind, always accelerating quite fast in the rate at which they yield these improvements. Marker assisted, where you use advanced genetic technologies to accelerate the process of plant breeding without introducing new transgenes into the crops. Then we have innovations that are less well discussed, but very often highly effective. Participatory breeding, where farmers speak with each other about what works and what doesn't work in the landscape, because these are often very localized issues. What works and doesn't work can vary up a hillside or north side or the south side of a valley. And open source platforms for seed sharing, allowing, instead of the exercise of intellectual property, allowing farmers and other extension agencies to help make seed production more productive for particular agronomic systems. So these are all innovations. They are all the process of developing the way we do things to improve our activities. And it is not self-evident then which one of these would necessarily be the future in any given setting. But what we also know about innovation processes in agriculture, as well as in health and in energy and in transport and in information technology, what we know is, although looking forward, there are many different branching paths, when we look back, we see very powerful processes of closure. Societies and economies close down these diversity of pathways. So to give you an example, one set of processes for closure come from social expectations. If finance markets expect a particular innovation pathway to be the one that is followed, then simply by expecting that, they make it more likely. Because if in capitalism, if something is thought to be more likely, it is less risky. If it is less risky, you pay less for capital. If you pay less for capital, then the infrastructure can be built more quickly. So there is a powerful positive feedback that makes things that finance markets expect more likely actually to happen. And we know that history locks in very quickly. There is path dependency in the way innovations work. For instance, the keyboards that we all use around the world now, although they're different between different languages, they are all based on the principle that neighboring letters should not interfere with each other in a typewriter. These are from the 19th century, so to try to stop typewriters locking up. The problem with these keyboards is because letters that are used frequently together must not jam, so they are spread out on the keyboard. This means that the keyboards can be more harmful to operators. They can cause repetitive strain injuries. We can hurt ourselves typing fast on these keyboards. So they're not good keyboards anymore, but we are still locked into these keyboards. No one is trying to keep us there. We just find ourselves locked in, a little bit like biological evolution and speciation. Then we have, when power comes into play, political entrapment, where governments and regulators and markets are deliberately manipulated by powerful interests, like the automobile industry, for instance, configuring cities around the world through the 20th century to become dependent on the car to exclude public transport. And that happens in many different sectors. Regulators are captured by the industries. This is not a revolutionary point to make. It's simply the way regulation and markets work. And even in perfectly competitive markets, or as near as we get in consumer markets, for instance, we get lock-in. We get, for instance, computer software locks in, video standards, audio standards lock in, quite often to formats that everyone agrees are actually not the best. We could do better, but the market locks in. So there are many, many processes that make it look like there's just one pathway. And when regulation, when the governance of science and technology, like GM technologies or IT or pharmaceuticals, when we come to ask questions about which technologies we are choosing, how we are introducing them, they tend to be in terms of risk assessment. Around the world, the only real governance intervention on the direction of technology is to ask questions about risk, asking simply, is this particular technology that is proposed by the loudest voices, by the most powerful interest, is it safe enough? Usually, actually, I've served on these committees in a European setting. The question is not, is this safe? The question is this tolerable? Can we tolerate this new chemical? We get very precise pictures of these risks from our risk assessments from expert committees or big government studies. And it's on that basis that we then choose a particular implementation. But we're not asking questions about what options might be better. We're not asking questions about what would be the most sustainable innovation. We're asking questions about, is this thing that is already locked in, is it tolerable? So let me quickly say something about why that is problematic. And here I'm going to talk about risk assessment techniques, which are used around the world across completely different sectors, not just in the biotech sector, in chemicals, for instance, in pharmaceuticals, in energy. And it is in the energy sector where these techniques of comparative risk assessment are at their most advanced and sophisticated, comparing different strategies. So I use that to make my example. And my point is this, that a particular committee, and it could be in any country, I think, this picture, or in any intergovernmental organization, these techniques, for instance, are not only recommended, but required by the World Trade Organization. If a country introduces a regulation in agriculture, in health, in materials, that is not based on risk assessment, then it becomes subject to an appeal under the World Trade Organization adjudication procedures. So these are very strongly backed, these techniques. And so the details, of course, vary, but the common picture is this. When a particular committee expresses an estimate of the risks associated with different technologies, it does so like this diagram. It looks very precise. It looks quite easy to see which are the less risky, which are the more risky technologies. We see this kind of debate playing out at the moment around the vaccines. We see precise figures put by regulatory bodies, even though there's a lot of uncertainty. And the problem with this is that behind those precise pictures actually lies, in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, not going beyond that, a very much more uncertain reality. So here we see 21 studies used in OECD countries. And here I'm looking not only at studies that are peer-reviewed, I'm looking at studies that are used in law, has cited in law in an OECD country. So these 21 studies were all peer-reviewed, but they were also all cited in law in an OECD country regulating the nuclear industry. And you can see that these 21 studies spread very widely. Look at the horizontal scale. It is a logarithmic scale. So the difference between studies that are pessimistic or optimistic about the answer to the question, how risky is nuclear power, vary by more than 4 orders of magnitude. There's a factor of 50,000 difference in that peer-reviewed literature between pessimistic and optimistic studies. An individual study will say just one precise answer, but the literature as a whole is very much more wide. And the same is true of all the other options. So my point is this: the techniques of risk assessment that are required by the World Trade Organization for governing technology, that we treat as if they give us these sound scientific answers, actually are a social process of closure. In these committees, the committees, and I've served on these, pick an answer from among many that could be possible. And it is typically possible across different sectors to justify any choice one likes across different innovation pathways using these techniques. And the reason for this is that alongside the very rigorous quantitative procedures in risk assessment, which I respect greatly, probabilistic analysis, there are also a whole series of unavoidable qualitative framing assumptions that are necessary in order to get an answer out of the risk assessment. For instance, about what the boundaries of the system is. How big is a technology? Is it just is it, for instance, with an energy technology, is it just the gas turbine or the wind turbine? Or do you move back to look at the entire industry that makes it, the steel and the concrete? What about the future? Do we discount the future every year? Do we depreciate the value of risks by 3%, by 5%, by 6%, by 0%? There is no self-evident correct answer to this. We can adopt conventions, but the crucial point is just those two assumptions. If you change them, you change the answer you get. And these assumptions are basically political. It's not that these committees are getting things wrong. It's not that they are perpetrating fraud. They are simply taking the path of least resistance, adopting assumptions they think are reasonable to their political, not scientific, but political view, and out comes the answer. It's a very interesting phenomenon, I think. So what can we do about this? We can do better. We can think about uncertainty in a much broader way. So the concept of risk comes from the idea of things may happen, they may be good, they may be bad, they may have a certain magnitude in harm or in money. And there are two parameters. The first parameter is our knowledge about how likely something is. So for a risk assessment, you need to have high confidence in your knowledge about probabilities. And that's when risk assessment can be used, cost-benefit analysis. These techniques that the World Trade Organization requires to use can be used under conditions of risk, where we're confident in our knowledge about the probabilities. But there is also a condition under which we are not confident in our knowledge about our probabilities. And that, for 100 years now, in the English language anyway, has been the actual meaning of uncertainty. The difference between uncertainty and risk is at risk, you can assign a probability. Uncertainty, you cannot have confidence in a single probability function. And this can be for many reasons. It could be because the system is open and dynamic with many variables that are not fully understood, or very low frequency events. Nuclear accidents, for instance, are fortunately quite infrequent, so we're not so sure about the probabilities for particular plants. Human factors, where complex human intentionalities, sabotage, and that kind of thing comes into it, or changing context, where the world itself, as of course it is at the moment with climate change, is changing rapidly. We can't be sure that the past will be a reliable guide to the future. So these are reasons for not having confidence in the probabilities that underpin risk assessment. But there's another axis to this, which is the things that may happen, the good or bad things. We may also not be confident in our knowledge definitively about that. This is the condition of ambiguity, where we disagree, where the values in play are different, where we disagree about benefit or harm. For instance, for GM crops, what is the notion of benefit? Is it benefit to the farmer, benefit to the industry that provides, profit to the industry that provides the technologies, benefit to the world in some way, or harm to consumers, or harm to small farmers, or harm to ecosystems? Each of these different definitions will give you very different pictures of the pros and cons of different agricultural technologies. But they're not, risk assessment doesn't handle these. It just treats the metric of harm or benefit as self-evident. We could ask how fair things are. We could ask what the alternatives are. These are not questions of probability, they're questions of ambiguity. And they also lead to the kind of differences that I showed you in the diagram earlier. And then finally, we go to the bottom right-hand corner, the Rumsfeld corner, the unknown unknowns, the problem where we don't know what we don't know. Both ambiguity and uncertainty are present. And we face the prospect of surprise. This may not be bad. Surprises can be good. The laser was a nice surprise. Phages have been a nice surprise in some ways. I guess maybe colleagues are working on those now. But they can also be bad. The ozone hole was a surprise. Endocrine disrupting chemicals were a surprise. It wasn't that we thought maybe there's going to be an ozone hole, but it's a low probability. At the time when it arose, it was really quite a shocking surprise. The institutions didn't expect it at all. Endocrine disrupting chemicals, the very mechanism was not even included in regulation. So I think we sometimes get trapped by our language. Because the World Trade Organization insists we call these techniques risk, we think everything is risk, therefore probabilities can always be applied. But they simply cannot. It's not a rigorous approach. It's highly political situation. So why then does so much of the world in different countries and the World Trade Organization, different agencies, even the IPCC, why do we find ourselves so much in that top left box? Applying risk assessment, like for a person who has a hammer, every problem is a nail. We hit every problem with this risk assessment hammer. Why do we do this? Is it because people are bad or maybe stupid? And I want to be very clear, I'm not criticizing individuals here. The reason institutions, the reason individual regulators and business organizations do this is not because they are bad or stupid. It's because they are forced to do it by institutions, by powerful institutions, like, for instance, liability law. Liability law says to a company, if you could not reasonably have expected something, then you do not need to take account of it. And then the responsibility to the shareholders of a company director says, you are only supposed to consider things that feature in the profit of this company. So liability law and company law together mean that the head of a big company has to move away from ignorance to uncertainty. They never face ignorance, because if ignorance exists, it's someone else's problem. It's not their problem. But the ignorance may still be there. It's just they don't have to think of it. Likewise, if they then get an insurance policy and that gets reinsured on reinsurance markets, then they move from uncertainty to risk. They pay a premium, they have a risk problem. If uncertainty is worse than we thought, then the insurance markets will simply go bankrupt. So the uncertainties still exist, but they're hidden by institutions. And this is the way in which society around technology and innovation hides uncertainty and hides ambiguity and hides ignorance and forces decision makers to make decisions all the time on the basis of risk. So what I'm saying here is that often we find, and it may be a reaction to the pandemic at the moment, that the situations in which societies move away from this, move out of the risk box, is when social movements protest, when they raise controversies, and then the institutions change. We see this on nuclear power. We saw this on GM in some countries, in Europe, for instance. Whatever one thinks about the questions, bigger questions are raised. It wasn't possible simply to say the risk assessment has settled the issue. Because wider society, because democracy said, no, we're not happy. We want to talk about pros and cons. We want to talk about alternatives, questions that are not asked in risk assessment. And when that happens, there are plenty of scientific techniques that can be used. It's not like we don't have tools for dealing with uncertainty. We have precautionary appraisal from the precautionary principle, looking at uncertainty, not at risk. All kinds of decision heuristics, interval analysis, sensitivity testing. Maybe colleagues here have used some of these techniques. They don't rely on probabilities. So we can do these things. Likewise, ambiguity, where we disagree about values and interests. We have scenario analysis. We have backcasting. We have interactive modeling, multi-criteria mapping, Q method. Many, many quantitative and qualitative methods for dealing with ambiguity exist, if only they were invited to the regulatory party. Likewise, even under ignorance, where we don't know what we don't know, we can look at ways of learning and adaptation. Civic research, give people the ability to do their own research. Monitoring, which is not a very sexy subject for a lot of science, but if we do more monitoring, we often find surprises sooner. Flexibility and diversity. Don't put all your eggs in one basket in technology. So there are plenty of practical solutions which we don't follow because we think risk assessment is enough. We move from the top left down to the bottom right. But if we use these techniques, we could show, and this is an example from a study I did on GM, which I can talk about in the questions if you like, for a British advisory committee. Each one of these squares in the right-hand side was an expert on an advisory committee showing their opinion of the pros and cons of different agricultural strategies, including GM. And when that study was done, we saw for the first time that British scientific advisors disagreed with each other massively, even though their committees came to one answer. They themselves disagreed. So I draw my talk to a close. I look forward to discussing some of these points together with colleagues here. My point is that these are reasons why the challenges are not about anti-science reactions. It's about a struggle for more democracy around innovation. And actually the fault lies in the high level ways in which technologies like GM, like other biotech, like advanced technologies in different sectors are spoken about in the World Trade Organization, in different countries, in the OECD. We see this left-hand side, this idea of a one-track race. We only ask questions about what risk, and we neglect that there are many different innovation pathways which we should be speaking about if we want to be rigorous and if we want to be democratic. So I would say then that GM controversies and other technology controversies are much more about unquantifiable uncertainty than they are about quantified risk. And we are being misled by risk debates that we're forced into all the time. the key questions are not about how fast to go with the particular technologies that industry wishes to develop. There's nothing wrong with industry. It's doing its best, but it has incentives. So of course it will follow some technologies, not others. We should ask bigger questions for society as a whole about that. It doesn't mean one is critical even of industry, let alone of science. That the irrational anxieties that there are is not then the public, who often will seem to be frightened of a particular technologies, but often they're not trusting of the powerful interests behind them, who themselves are showing that they're not actually trustworthy because they're only concerned with making the public accept the decision. It's a power dynamic. And as long as one actor tries to get the other one just to accept, then the other actor will not trust them. And I think in the end, it's about not only the public trusting scientists and trusting the innovation system, it's about the innovation system trusting the public, because the crucial decisions in innovation are not about how fast we go, they're about which way. And there is no one who can be an expert in which way. These are political decisions which we should be discussing as democracies. And if we manage to do that, then we are at the same time being both more rigorous about the challenges of technology, as well as being more democratic. And I think we would find that science will become less pressurized and damaged by these debates, and we would find ourselves with better technologies as well. So I hope that made some sense. I hope it was interesting, and I look forward very much to any comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stirling. Some questions or comments from the audience, please. You receive some claps.
Can I? How do we ask?
Alejandra has a question, please. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. I'm interested. Okay, who's sorry?
Yo tengo una pregunta, ¿puedo participar? Soy Miguel Ara.
Yes. First, Alejandra Covarrubias.
Okay. Hello, very nice talk. I really enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very important one, I think. I'm just curious. I quite agree with your reasoning, and what I would like to know whether this kind of analysis has been done for the Latin American region, and if you know some colleagues that are doing this kind of analysis.
Yes. Yes, I do know. I mean, this kind of analysis is not so easy to get funded.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's not, it is not the mainstream because it is very inconvenient. And I could tell you, if we went to a pub, maybe I could tell you stories about what happens when you do this kind of research. You can find yourself in a very difficult position. You make very powerful enemies. So all around the world, it is on the edges of these debates. But for instance, I came to UNAM, there's a group at Lancis, at the Ecological Institute at Lancis. There's some excellent people there, close to some of your group, I think, who are doing work on exactly this kind of issue. There's a very good group in Argentina called Fundación CENIT, on Institute for Transformations, doing work on this kind of stuff. So yes, there are groups that I know of, and I'm sure there are many that I do not know of, because my work has picked up on strands of work. For instance, the famous commentator on technology, Ivan Illich, did his work in Mexico, back now a long time ago. So this is in the tradition of work that Mexico has pioneered in some ways, I think.
Yeah. I can ask another question, Cesar, Julio?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, the other question is, once you have this kind of evaluation, then how to apply it? If you have a big country or if you have a small country or region. So I was just thinking now that you were talking about maybe the best way to apply this kind of evaluations would be just the analysis by more constrict regions, by smaller regions, and then you will have a better decision on what to do. What do you think about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. My honest answer is I don't know. I think there are some very important variables there. It could be, but I think there's two ways in which the problem changes. At the local level, in the more disaggregated setting, then yes, you can do as you say. You may have more hope of influencing the environment, but of that setting. But then, of course, the problem is that the wider world can impinge, and you're dealing with some of the main decisions have been made long before. In the politics of technology, there's a dilemma called the Collingridge dilemma, which is on exactly this. That when it's at the point when you can act, you have least impact, both in time and in space. So it's a more complicated challenge than simply that. I think in the end, actually, seeing the world in terms of neat levels is part of the problem, because actually that's another story that's very convenient to bureaucratic hierarchies, to see the world as neat levels. And I think maybe biologists know better than anyone that the world actually, when you look at it hard, is not neatly leveled. It's rhizomic, it's interconnected. There are fractal, non-scalar relations. So as a result of that, I think doing this at every level, I think society as a whole, that's why I mentioned democracy really, because it needs to be something that saturates the discourse, that everyone at every level is thinking about which way might we go, thinking whether it's on the local questions or on general policy, about direction being just as important as how fast. And I think societies that do that at every level are the ones that can find themselves able to be more progressive in the way I am saying.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So next question, please, Miguel Lara, and then Patricia Joseph, and finally Rodrigo. So please, Miguel Lara.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stirling. Thank you for your talk. It's very, very nice.
Thank you.
And let me ask you, in my point of view, the problem of innovation, or the scientific innovation, is that this process does not emanate from the cultural features of the social groups, and that's why it is a play that some view this as a risk, or the people do not understand what innovation means. Do you think we need to direct innovation to favor social groups and not companies?
Yes. So are you saying that innovation is not affected by social groups because it is determined by technology and by nature?
Well, it's determined by technology, not technology, it's determined by the market.
Yeah, yeah.
But not,
well, yes, yes. Okay, so the market, certainly the market, as I tried to say when I talked in my early part of my lecture about lock-in, markets can have a crucial effect. That is why we use Windows software, which I don't think there's anyone in the world would say Windows is the best software we can use. But we all have, well, very large parts of the world have it. And to the extent we then have Apple software, it starts becoming a problem as well. So yes, markets can exert strong effects, but the markets exist in a wider environment. The markets are shaped by institutions. For instance, capitalism is a very important way of shaping markets. I mentioned liability law. I mentioned insurance policies. These shape markets. So markets don't exist like a magnetic field that's a natural physical phenomenon. They are made by institutions. If we change institutions, then markets change too. So I don't think things do get determined by a market as it is, but one doesn't have to be a communist to say, I mean, one can be a communist, but one doesn't have to be to say a market will change if the institutions change. That's why the social democratic markets of a country like Denmark or Sweden are so different than from a country like China or a country like Brazil.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Patricia, go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, I want to move to the endocrine disruptors.
Please.
See, the Endocrine Society, the American Endocrine Society, made this task force, and I was invited as the Latin American representative for the endocrine disruptors. But it was a very discouraging thing, because I don't know if you know, there was the pharmacologist that would define what the toxicology of a compound and the ED50, etc., whether in endocrine disruptors, that doesn't work. So the science is known. And the worst thing is that BPA, that acts as an estrogen, right? And that's why it gets all these problems, or the phthalates, which come from the plastic bottles, that works like a thyroid hormone. And all these terrible things, especially in the pregnant women.
Yes, absolutely.
But the thing is that industry changes from BPA to BPS.
Yes.
So they announced that it doesn't have BPA, but it has BPS. And it's the same shit. I mean, it makes the same terrible problems.
Yes.
And we don't have the task force anymore.
Yes.
Apparently in the European Union, they spent, I don't know how many, even years to define what was an endocrine disruptor.
Yes.
And it's sort of everything, plastic, steel, everywhere. And I don't see any government or anybody, any organization, anything really fighting against it.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I mentioned endocrine disruptors. You have unfolded that story very well. Thank you. That's I didn't realize you worked on these issues, Patricia, but thank you for that story. And I think you're right. This is exactly the kind of case I'm talking about, where the regulatory process, the governance process of innovation is like a storytelling process. It's really there to stabilize, to allow certain interests to maximize their benefits. And so we tell stories, always simple stories. And in this case, the vector of harm simply wasn't considered. The procedures and protocols simply didn't work. And it wasn't that people involved in the systems were just stupid. They were just put in that position by these institutions that required them to not ask certain questions. I think, you know, the European Chemicals Directive does a better job, but no one in the world is doing a good job of looking at endocrine disruption. It's just like the prion agent with BSE. I mean, now we have the COVID pandemic is a virus. There at least are institutions that are dealing with this. At the time of the bovine spongiform encephalopathy with the prion agents, the prion wasn't, what is a prion? There's no one whose job was to look at prions. So vertical transmission was thought to be impossible until, you know, it was and they didn't research it deliberately because they were frightened they might find it was vertically transmitted. So I think you've put your finger on exactly the kind of problem. If we had a society that recognized that we shouldn't always, as we are with the pandemic, say, follow the science. If we didn't always say, follow the science because the science will tell us what to do, we would actually be able to address these problems much more rationally. Because at the moment, science cannot answer many of these questions. It can give us vital information that we have to have. It's crucial, but it's necessary, not sufficient. And what we also need along with the science is a healthy democratic debate about the uncertainties, about the ambiguities, and about the ignorance. And I think if we did that with endocrine disruptors, we would be asking questions that are much more relevant that the science can't answer, like, for instance, substitutes. So as you say, moving from one bisphenol to another bisphenol is really not a solution. And when we look at other problems in regulation, countries like Germany, for instance, are very interesting. They move from, for instance, chlorine bleach to oxygen bleach. Everyone around the world in different countries saying, this is crazy, they're going to go bankrupt, it's much too expensive. Within a few years, everyone's doing it. Because typically when you move to a complete substitute, you find that it is actually better even for the companies in the first place making the products. So I think getting companies to move to radically different alternatives, not just a different variety of the same chemical, requires democratic pressure. That's why I talked about protest. Europe has managed to do these things. Germany managed to do them well because the green movement is so strong. So that's why I make the political point I do. It's part of the rigorous process is to allow protest, to allow challenge.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next question, Rodrigo Arreola, please. Go ahead.
Hi, I have two questions for you. The first one is somehow related with what you were just talking about, and it would be like usually technology just shift when you have prices, because you don't usually take a lot of time thinking about the alternatives, right? You just take whatever it's in the market.
Yes.
And do you think that literacy, like, because we do it because we don't know all the other options, we are illiterate, right? And do you think that literacy would help people to get
Yes.
answers?
Well, and when you say literacy, you mean scientific literacy?
Yeah, like no, like for example, for the operating systems and computers,
Yes.
you just know Windows,
Yes.
let's say,
Yes.
and it's already installed in your computer when you buy it.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there is no way you will
Yes.
learn about Linux unless you do a
No.
little research.
Yes, that's a great point. But I think this is, I mean, problems of technology are not actually more complex than other problems. Society is a very complicated place. So education, foreign policy, security policy, welfare policy are extremely complex systems. And we don't have a trouble as societies generally of accepting that experts in those fields cannot tell us exactly what the right answer is. So you're absolutely right that these challenges are complex and that expertise is essential. Literacy, in your terms, is essential. It's as I said earlier, it's necessary. But actually, many of the most important issues in choices between technologies are not about these technical details. They're about, like, for instance, take the energy sector. At the moment, to achieving zero carbon, we could follow nuclear, we could follow renewables, and there's many different renewables and many different kinds of infrastructure for renewables. We could try and do carbon capture and storage. Now, at the moment, the IPCC has geoengineering, negative emissions technology built into its models. People don't talk about that, but basically the way the IPCC models work, they only work for many of the more optimistic assumptions because they have assumed the world will be doing climate geoengineering. Now, the key issues in climate geoengineering are not around exactly how you interfere with the energy flux of the atmosphere. It's around, is it right to try to mess around with the Earth in this kind of way just to control the global temperature? So the experts who know about that have a very strong interest in it. They tend to be very keen on doing it because they think we have to do it. But society as a whole can ask much more difficult questions. Likewise, the difference between nuclear and renewable energies are not just resting on ionizing radiation or how many birds are killed by wind turbines. They're questions about politics, about what kinds of society we want to live in. So I feel that literacy, yes, is crucial, but in the end, it's just a society of citizens who ask rigorous questions. They don't have to have the answers. They just have to have the power to ask questions, and the society will then make more robust decisions, even when the individual people asking the questions are not experts or literate in those terms. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, we cannot know like a lot of like there is a lot of topics that construct our reality. Like it's a multi-thread reality, and we cannot be experts in all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've sat on advisory committees where the same dilemma, I mean, for instance, on the pandemic at the moment, people talk about scientists. They say, oh, you're a scientist. They have them on the radio. Please talk about this. But scientists know that the bandwidth of what they are an expert in in relation to something as complex as a pandemic is very, very narrow, and other neighboring expertise are crucial, and no one is an expert in all these topics. So we really allow ourselves to live a lie in a way by pretending expertise is something that it's not. There is no expert in any technology. There's just hundreds of types of expertise come into understanding it. So in that sense, there's no one who is literate in that sense, because there are so many different kinds of knowledge involved.
Okay. For my second question, you mentioned that in a panel of experts, individuals don't have an agreement, but that the panel reach a consensus.
Yes.
So I would like to ask, what's driving this consensus, and if there is any way to do it better?
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you. And I guess here again, like with so many of the other questions, there are people in this group who know much more about this than me. I've served on a few advisory committees as a social scientist working with natural scientists. So I have seen this process up close in a European and British setting, but it's of course a very small statistical sample to extrapolate from. But I would say, to answer your question directly, scientists typically are very highly motivated. When they're on these committees, they want to be helpful. And they genuinely believe that the way they should be helpful is by coming to consensus. Because they're told by the politicians, and even more by the politicians' gatekeepers, they say to the committee, you have got to come up with one answer. The minister doesn't want to hear, on the one hand, on the other hand, they want to hear, do this. And then actually, they also get told, and by the way, the thing that you say to do should be this. That's how science advice works in practice. So the scientists, I think the most important thing is they want to be helpful. But what's happening is they are being pressurized into being helpful to a politician, not helpful to society, because the interests are different. A politician, and it's a very difficult job, I mean no disrespect to a politician or a senior company executive or a head of an NGO, it's all the same. When you're a powerful figure, the most precious commodity that you can have is justification. The ability to defend your decision. Now that justification is not the same thing as being correct. You can be wrong, but very defended because a committee told you. So if it all goes wrong, you say, well, don't blame me. I just did what the science said. I'm following the science. If you have a problem with this, blame the scientists. Are you familiar with this dynamic, I think, as scientists? So this pressure for justification is political pressure. And I've experienced this very strongly from politicians or from civil servants saying, you must come up with a consensus because otherwise you are not protecting the politician. But actually, a politician could make a decision. It doesn't stop them making a decision. It just means when they make a decision on a science issue, they say, well, if you don't like this decision, blame me, because the main factor in my decision was a value judgment. I listened to the scientists. They said, on the one hand, this, on the other hand, this. They gave me reasons, and I decided. And that makes them accountable. So that's why I talk about democracy, really. I think that by opening up these science and technology decisions, we allow science to do what it is good at, of saying conditionally, if you do A, then X will happen. If you do B, then Y will happen. But you have to decide between A and B. And we also have a more democratic society because the politicians are more clearly responsible for the decisions that they make. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer to that question.
Yeah, and also like these committees are usually within a private discussion, right? Like it's a closed discussion that is
Yes.
not,
Yes.
The society is not invited to the discussion usually.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have to say, I mean, I've given you there the more attractive reasons why scientists will feel pressure. There are unattractive reasons too. For instance, personal advancement. I know for sure that committees chairmen, and they're usually men, sadly, in the settings I've been in, but the chairs of committees know that unless they get a consensus, they won't get an award later. You know, in Britain, it's the Queen gives awards, Sir this, Sir that, Lord this, Lord that. They won't get that if they have an engineered consensus. So, and there's also, sometimes they're paid. A big company will pay them a massive grant. So there are unattractive reasons as well, but I didn't want to emphasize that because I think there's a lot of very honorable people working and they're trying to be helpful. So it's not always a bad thing, but they're nonetheless accidentally undermining both science and democracy, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Carla Mesa has another question. Do you want to make it personally, Carla, or you want me to read it?
Could you please read it? Thank you.
Yes. Well, the question is, how do you talk about this with politicians? The myth of science to technology to progress is easy to talk about in the public discourse. Yes. When politicians demand certainty, how do we talk about uncertainty without being ignored?
Yes, thank you. A great question. Thank you, Carla, for that question. It's difficult. There's no doubt about that. But something I've learned, I learned it very slowly, I'm afraid. I'm a slow learner on this. Because you can imagine the kind of thing I'm saying, this idea of opening up the lack of consensus in scientific processes is not popular to politicians for the reasons we were just discussing and lies behind your question. But I have on a few occasions had meetings with British ministers or commissioners of the European Commission. That has always been either at a time of big controversy, so they're frightened. Everything's gone wrong. The machine has gone wrong. They're forced to listen to the critics. Then they'll come to someone like me. I won't get an invitation normally until there's a crisis. That's why the committees I've served on have been on GM or on nuclear or on chemicals when there's an emergency, a political emergency, I mean. So that's the first thing. You take the opportunities when they arise. But another thing I've found out is that often it's not actually the politician themselves who's the main source of pressure. It's the people around them. So in that example I was talking about just a moment ago with the committees in Britain on GM, and we did a study looking at the different opinions of different members of the committee. First of all, I only got to do that because I was supported by Unilever, a pro-GM company who funded my work, because they were frightened about the consumers. So they were forced to look more generally. They funded me to do this analysis. The government only let me do it because Unilever were behind me, and they thought, well, this is crazy. We have this kind of critical academic, but we have a big multinational. This is interesting. We can't resist this. And when the senior British civil servant in charge of food policy saw the type of chart I was showing, I showed it briefly in my presentation with several different committee members, all with very different answers. He said to me, only an academic could think this would be useful. This is completely useless. When you get in front of the minister with this, you're going to die, and I am going to enjoy watching you die. So that's quite strong language from a British civil servant. But the minister was actually pleased, and she said to me, thank you for this. I never get this picture normally. I always get told everyone agrees. And then I have to ask, what have you assumed? And so I'm being managed by my civil servants. And if you present information like you're saying, Professor Stirling, then I would be able to answer back my civil servants. And it was a very delightful moment for me. The other guy was behind her when she said this, the guy who said, I'm going to enjoy watching you die. And I think he needed closure to control his boss. So the opportunities then can come when we least expect them, partly because the world is a complicated place, when there are protests, when there are social movements, when there's an opportunity from a multinational asking difficult questions, then you get an opportunity to raise the kinds of issues I'm saying and open up a bit. So it's just a question of taking those chances, and sometimes quite good things can happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments? Okay.
Yes, I have just. Can I speak?
Yes, please.
Yes, and I was wondering in a relationship with scientists and their tendency to maybe to assess risks more than to take into account the other dimensions that you spoke about, uncertainty, ambiguity, etc. Yeah. So should they have another training, or what do we do with scientists? I mean, we are trying to get generally we are trying to get to a precise answer to the questions. So, but in fact, what do you think about this for the scientists?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a very good question. Again, all these questions are very good. I cannot pretend to finally answer these kinds of things, but I can say something about it. I would say the most important quality is humility. Be more humble. Yes, of course, you're an expert in a very narrow field. So say what you know about that field. Even in the very narrow field, there'll typically be uncertainties, but just refrain from using the privilege of a leading scientist on a high advisory committee to then pronounce upon all kinds of factors that are not to do with your science. So be more humble about what you know about your specialist field, and be more humble about engaging in issues that are not to do with your science. So for instance, if you're an expert in virology and society is choosing between alternative strategies for dealing with viruses, then you can speak very much to the technical issues with their uncertainties. But when it comes to the economics or the social science or the different political strategies, that is something that you can't really be expected to know about. And yet typically around the world at the moment in the pandemic, I see, because they're trying to be helpful, many specialist scientists talking about issues that really aren't their specialism. And in being that more humble, I think that is being more scientific. I don't know what the motto is of the Academy of Science in Mexico, but the British Royal Society, the British National Academy of Science, when it was set up in the 17th century, the motto was nullius in verba, not on authority. It's really ironic, because now the British Royal Society is brought in again and again as an authority. And it's really, I think that is actually, I don't want to be too harsh about this, but I think that is betraying science. Science has always been about questions, about argument, about communitarianism, about open discussion, about affording equality to other members of your community. And increasingly now science, when it gets tangled in politics, is acting as an authority, which was not just not science, it's what science originally started in order to challenge. So over several hundred years, science has turned into the thing that it used to be fighting.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very nice talk.
Thank you.
Yes, one last comment, and I believe we can finish. So Nayeli Magaña says, it has been a very interesting seminar, and I am grateful for having this type of talk with our community in the IBT, and thanks to Dr. Stirling for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. And for me too, it's been very rewarding experience. I thank all the colleagues for the discussion. It's very interesting. And I wish you well with your work, because it's not easy, I know. And it's easy sometimes for someone outside to make these critical remarks, but I really respect the hard thinking that goes on in science about these issues. So good luck with all your endeavors.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Y muchas gracias a todos por conectarse al seminario, y los esperamos el próximo lunes. De todos modos, este seminario ya ha sido grabado, así que se va a subir a la página del instituto para que lo puedan consultar durante esta semana. Muchas gracias.